So guess what? I'm not sure if you guys were aware, but yesterday's video was entirely filmed and edited with Final Cut Pro on the iPad Pro. And that would be impressive if this thing wasn't $2,100. I think that's where I primarily take issue when most people are saying, wow, look, I'm doing some kind of pro workflow on the iPad. Wow, the iPad kind of has external monitor support. Wow, the iPad kind of can write software. Wow, the iPad can kind of run Final Cut. Is that you'd have a point, you'd have an argument if this was substantially cheaper than a Mac. And even on the low end, even with the entry-level M1 iPad Air, that thing's only got 64 gigs of storage, so don't go bragging about how that thing is gonna be fine for beginners who want to try out Final Cut for 50 bucks a year. No, you're gonna want at least 256 gigs of storage if you're actually editing videos, which is what all M1 MacBooks ship with by default, mind you. And there's a ton of features that you can't even access with Final Cut on the iPad unless you have a keyboard and mouse connected to it, because they had to fundamentally rethink Final Cut. And as you'll see in this video, there's actually very little things they didn't change. So other than the fact that they're both called Final Cut and they're both made by Apple and they're both apps, there's honestly not too many similarities to begin with. As someone who's been a diehard Final Cut video editor for all of my videos over the past 6-7 years, I know it fairly well, and yet transitioning to the iPad, it's quite shocking how little the skills and tools actually translated. You basically have to teach yourself like it's a brand new application from the beginning. So without further ado, let's compare Final Cut for iPad versus Final Cut for Mac. So day one, I'm quite confused why Apple felt like they needed to release this now. I feel like there's definitely some things that could be fixed and added within just a couple months of software patches. They could have announced it at DubDub and then not shipped it until the fall with iPadOS 17. But no, they didn't want to do that. They wanted it to come out right now for whatever reason. And because of that, there's a ton of missing features. There's obvious ones, and then there's redesigns, which are, in my opinion, like, okay, it's cool that the iPad can do it, but it just results in more steps, and because you had to fundamentally rethink the way the feature worked, it's not really in any way better than the Mac version. It's just possible with more button clicking. So acknowledging some of the stuff that's missing right off the bat, color correction tools. There's a very clean and very basic exposure and saturation triangle up in the clip inspector on the Mac version, which I use pretty much for all of my videos, and they basically have just removed that on the iPad version. Instead, you have to drag in color effects from the effects tab, and then they give you essentially the same tools that the basic Photos app gives you. It's not really high intensive color correct data either, but hey, the one on the Mac is not that intricate either compared to what you can get for free on DaVinci Resolve, and to me it's just a fairly basic feature to leave out, as well as a lot of shortcuts like Command E for exporting, or markers by clicking M, or deactivating clips by pressing V. All of that's missing, as well as the stabilization feature, which a lot of people use for B-roll shots on the Mac version. Straight up, no option for that on the iPad. And just comparing the overall layout of how Final Cut is optimized on the iPad, almost it feels completely backwards. Like you've got your preview window on the top left, and then you've got your project media on the top right, whereas it's almost completely the opposite on the Mac version. You got project media over here, and then your preview in the center, and then your inspector on the right. Now, in order to inspect and edit clips individually, you do that via another tab that pops up on the left column. So essentially everything you know about Final Cut on the Mac, just flip the whole thing over and ignore everything you were taught because nothing is where they left it. I would have much rather, honestly, Apple go the lazy route, because we already know the M1 chip with macOS is capable of running Final Cut. I would have them rather just port that macOS version over to the iPad, even if that meant the touch friendliness was not very good, because at least it would have been a little bit more familiar. And before a lot of you go off and say, well, Drew, it's not fair to be comparing Final Cut on a 27-inch iMac versus a 13-inch iPad, but the truth is, if you account for aspect ratios, the iPad 12.9-inch display is actually technically larger in surface area than the 13-inch M1 MacBook Air, which I have edited many of my videos with Final Cut for Mac on that MacBook, and still all of these options are still here. They're a little bit more compressed, but they work totally fine. In fact, there were times where people were editing with Final Cut on 11 7-inch MacBook Air. So don't tell me that it's just not possible to do that on the iPad. It absolutely is, especially with this silicon. But overall, I will at least give some credit to Final Cut on the iPad for at least being the best video editor, in my opinion, available on iPadOS. It may not necessarily be the cheapest, of course, because DaVinci Resolve gives you lots of tools, as does LumaFusion, and those are either free or a one-time purchase, whereas Final Cut is an infinite expense. The more you use it, the more expensive it gets. Even if you do $50 a year, if you plan on video editing for 5-10 years, that quickly turns into a $250 to $500 expense. And a lot of us professionals plan on continuing to use this software for years to come. So in many ways, I would say for long-term ownership, this is actually more expensive than the Mac version. But probably the coolest addition that they brought to the iPad that I haven't seen done on even iMovie or LumaFusion is the ability to scrub your time head across the timeline. Most of the time when you make a touch-optimized video editor, they tend to fix the time head right mid in the center, and then you have to drag your clips left to right instead of being able to drag the time head itself, which I know a lot of people probably have forgotten this already because it's been a while, but in the past I used to edit all of my videos off of an iPad, and I've done it with iMovie, I've done it with LumaFusion. I have figured out like what the most optimized, efficient way is to editing these types of videos with a touch-based operating system, and while it can be done, it's definitely just not as fast as using a keyboard and mouse, because with a mouse you can objectively get a lot more precise. So I know a lot of people were pushing me to say, Drew, you're reviewing it wrong. You need to just do it for touch and just try it with touch. Well, we did the live stream. I tried it just with touch, and it's objectively slower, and half the features are missing, especially if you want to select multiple clips at the same time, which is another annoyance with the iPad version. So like something I do a lot is if I stabilize or color correct or crop in on one particular clip, and then I want to paste all of those effects onto the rest of the clips, I can copy that clip on the Mac version, drag to select all those other clips, and then hit paste attributes, which is a quick little keyboard shortcut. Very helpful. Final Cut on the Mac is the best, in my opinion. It's amazing. On the iPad, they don't have that keyboard shortcut, nor do they have any way for you to paste attributes of another clip to multiple clips. And you know, at first thought, I was like, well, okay, so if I can't paste attributes, I'll just wait till I'm done editing, select all of the clips, and turn them into a compound clip. You know, combine them all together, and then just apply those effects all at once. Well, it turns out you can't make compound clips with the Final Cut version for iPad. Why did they leave that out? I don't know. That's bizarre. It's a really common thing. I use it all the time on the Mac version, especially when we're editing the Talos of Tech and EV podcasts. Thank God I didn't edit the podcast on the iPad. That would have taken forever, and a bunch of features would have been missing for sure. But yeah, that just added a whole level of new frustration when there's basic things like that missing. And like I said, you can't even select multiple clips when you're in touch-only mode anyway, so the utility of it, in my opinion, is fundamentally limited when you're trying to just do it via touch. But yes, the fact that you can scrub around with the time head and have clips layered on top of each other and stuff, that is typically better than what most of the alternative video editing apps offer, but I feel like with time, they could also get better, and at least those are probably not going to be charging you $5 a month, which I appreciate. But the other annoyance I definitely got into quickly, at least with my style of video editing, depending on what you guys are editing, it could be totally different, and I'm not going to try to review every type of video editing style because there's so many, but at least for mine, I have to cut out a lot of dead air to edit out the mistakes and all of the portions of the video where I'm not speaking or getting to the point and that kind of thing. So when I'm editing a big uncut video clip, I want a way to cut through the dead air really, really fast. And with the iPad, at least they do have a shortcut if you're on the keyboard version where it's Command B to split a clip, but the annoyance is in order to split the clip, you have to have the clip selected. This objectively makes it more complicated and more time consuming than the Mac version where you can just convert your cursor into whatever you want. You can turn it into a hand to move the timeline around, you can convert it into a zoom tool, or you can convert it into a blade tool, which means now your mouse just turns into the cut button, and wherever you click on the timeline, doesn't matter if it's text, video, or audio, it will cut it, regardless of if you've selected it or not. And the reason I bring that up is because if you're dragging through a timeline and you have to click every single clip that you want to split, that objectively makes the experience take a lot longer than it would on the Mac. Not to mention, because you have to hold down Command the whole time, oftentimes you'll get the Command shortcuts pop up, and then you can't split the clips down the middle anyway. So that's able to recreate kind of what I use Final Cut for on my Mac, but again, it just takes longer, and I'd be willing to excuse that if this was like a $400 or $500 product, but when most people that are going to be using Final Cut on iPad had to buy an M1 version, which is at least, of course, if you get a keyboard case or an Apple Pencil, easily going to be $800 plus. This iPad model, once you spec it with a keyboard and trackpad, is well over $2,000. Yeah, that's really, really hard to justify when there are M1 MacBook Airs, which you can find on Amazon with a terabyte of storage and 16 gigs of RAM for $1,500, and that'll have more ports, that'll have a headphone jack, that'll have a better keyboard, a bigger trackpad, probably better speakers. So there's reasons to buy an iPad. I'm not trying to deny that, like note-taking or drawing. Apple Pencil features in particular, you cannot really emulate outside of an iPad because nothing else supports the Apple Pencil, but the idea of buying an iPad specifically so that you can use it for Final Cut, I just think is a bad idea because of how many limitations there are and the price of buying an iPad this expensive, despite all the limitations it would have to a cheaper Mac. But don't wait, there's more. So another thing I do in my videos a lot is either zoom in for Ken Burns or cropping in on occasion, and on the Mac, they make that pretty simple with the transform tool right beneath your preview. So you select a clip, you go to crop, and then boom, you have the Ken Burns option. Whereas on the iPad, you have to select the clip and then hit inspect, because that needs to be a hidden window apparently, then hit the transform option, then hit the crop tools, and then select Ken Burns. And I will admit that yes, once you finally get into the Ken Burns setting, they do make it fairly easy and intuitive to adjust where the video clip starts and where it ends, making zooming in and out really intuitive. But again, it just takes way more clicks than it does on the Mac because I guess they had to make it touch friendly, which means burying a lot of menus and hiding things that used to be a lot easier. Like on the Mac version, you can access all of your project media simultaneously while looking at the color correction box or the transition box or the timeline box, and I guess that's harder to do with the iPad because they're probably optimizing it mostly for 11-inch displays. But again, I've seen this version of Final Cut work very, very well with a 13-inch MacBook Air, which is technically a smaller surface area than an iPad Pro. So I don't think you necessarily need all of these menu options to be hidden, but they probably just felt like, well, we're redesigning it from the ground up, and I guess we want to make it feel less familiar to the Mac version. Maybe they're trying to cater it towards new video editors for some reason, but honestly, very difficult to justify. As well as appearance options are totally different. Final Cut on the Mac gives you many timeline options for whether or not you actually want thumbnails on your clip previews, or if you just want the waveforms, which for my kind of video editing, where most of my A-roll is just of a single shot, I don't need those previews. They're just wasting time, and I need to see those waveforms so that I can edit more accurately. And they only really let you adjust the height of the clips. They don't let you turn off the thumbnails by any means, so there's just less overall viewing options on the iPad version. And on top of that, let's get to performance. So like I said, back when I reviewed the M1 MacBook Air, it was handling everything I threw at it like a champ. Pretty much the only limitation compared to my iMac Pro was the export times, but everything else the M1 chip did better. And again, that's with a fanless MacBook that came out nearly 3 years ago. And this is an M1 iPad Pro, so yes, it is probably a bit more thermally limited because it doesn't have as big a heatsink as the M1 MacBook Air has, and it doesn't have as big a battery life. But my god, if you're scaling down Final Cut on the iPad to not overwhelm the battery life or not overheat the chip or anything, this is still really bad for me. So I edited, of course, my whole Pixel 6a review, filmed on the iPad Pro and edited on the iPad Pro because people said it would be cool for me to do that, completely forgetting that I've already done this with other video editing apps on the iPad in the past. But okay, we'll ignore that. And just after probably 10 or 15 minutes of editing, I started noticing immediate lag, which was quite frustrating, and the timeline starts getting really, really choppy and less responsive. And because I've edited exactly these kinds of videos before with an M1 chip, I know that the M1 chip is much more capable than Apple is giving it credit for, and I have to imagine this just has something to do with throttling of the chip or poor RAM optimization for Final Cut, because not only were there a ton of times where it got so laggy that I had to stop and wait for the waveforms to load, and not only were there multiple, probably 4 or 5 app crashes where in the middle of editing Final Cut just crashes and you have to open the app again and figure out where you left off, but also it started rendering the waveforms improperly. So it says there's volume when there isn't, and there wasn't volume where it claimed it was, which for my kind of editing where you have to go through and cut out all of the dead air, that is basically an instant like deal breaker for me. And the fact that it was doing that on a very very, very basic video, mind you. Sure, it's a 4K at 60 video file, but it was not ProRes, you know, it was just shot off of the iPad's camera, which is essentially the same camera that's in the iPhone 11. It's not that fancy of a bit rate, it's not that high a file size. Very, very simple, and yet it couldn't handle that because I guess there's just too many cuts in the timeline. It made it incredibly frustrating, and it took way longer to edit that video than it should have. Typically, a video as long as that Pixel review should have taken me like an hour to an hour and a half, and it was well over 2.5 hours, and the video was still not done because of all the app crashes and me having to open it again and having to wait for the waveforms to load and the lagginess of the timeline. And as a lot of you guys probably picked up on, I apologize by the way, it lost a lot of my progress. So typically I'm pretty good at capturing all the points in the video where I make a mistake, like, oh, that's a repeat, oh, I was supposed to cut that out. So typically I do. If you've been watching my videos for the past 2 or 3 years, you know that I've been pretty accurate at cutting out all of the mistakes. So I was doing the same thing when editing on the iPad, but I found out once the video went live that when the Final Cut app crashes, it forgets a lot of your progress. And because it crashes randomly, obviously, you don't get to control when the app crashes, you're not entirely sure when all of your progress has been finalized. So even though I had gone through and watched the whole video and cut out all of the mistakes, and then I was coming to the end and I was adding the outro credits and the outro, once I got another crash, it was almost impossible to know, wait, did it lose all of my saves where I took out those mistakes? Apparently it didn't, because a lot of them were still unfortunately left in, which makes the video feel a whole of a lot less professional, that's for sure. And I apologize for not watching like the finalized exported video, but I was already working like 2 hours later than I was expected to yesterday, so I just figured, because I had already watched it in Final Cut, that it was as I edited it when I exported it. So I guess if you're editing with Final Cut on the iPad and if you're experiencing crashes, even though this iPad has 16 gigs of RAM and the M1 MacBook Air I reviewed only had 8, yeah, this was not able to handle it for whatever reason. Another huge annoyance, of course, is importing media, because the iPad does not have Finder, it has the Files app, which just involves more steps being involved. You gotta hit the import button, and usually it defaults to iCloud Drive for some reason, like I want to import something from iCloud Drive even though I have like nothing there. So you gotta select, no, I want the files on my iPad, then you select them, but they still don't really support drag and drop as well as the Final Cut for Mac option does. You know, you can just download a picture to your downloads folder and just drag that file into your timeline and boom, it's there on the Mac. It's very easy and intuitive. But on the iPad, even if you have the Photos app and slide over, because Final Cut doesn't support split screen of any kind, it doesn't even support external monitor support, which is kind of hilarious. LumaFusion supports external monitors, but not Final Cut? Like, what? But yeah, I had Photos in slide over, and I tried to drag over a picture into the timeline, but no, it would not accept it. That's too crazy. So instead, you have to drag it into Project Media, which also is not presently available half the time because you're sharing Project Media with effects in titles and generators and the inspector tool and all that. So you have to make sure you open Project Media, then drag pictures into Project Media before you drag them into the timeline. So again, you can kind of do what you do on the Mac version, but it just takes more steps, more time. That's also worth mentioning. The iPad will not edit video files off of an SSD. No clue why they don't let you do that, because the iPad has Thunderbolt, which is very capable, and in the past, when I'm using smaller bitrate files, I've edited videos off SD cards, which have far worse read and write speeds than the Thunderbolt port does on the iPad. So why the heck can you not access files and edit them on Final Cut when they're just loaded onto the SSD itself? No clue. That's just a really bizarre thing to leave out to me. Internal local storage, especially for devices like iPads and MacBooks, are so expensive. That's why a lot of people will buy a MacBook just with the base storage, 256 gigs, and then buy an external drive with 2 terabytes so that they can store a lot more files on it, of course, but also edit the files directly off of it. Tons of people do that, and you can't do it with the iPad. Although one thing I will give it credit for that is kind of cool in concept is the idea that, hey, you've got a pretty decent camera on the iPad, at least better than what you'd have on a Mac. So there's just a camera button on the top that you can click, and boom, you just can record videos straight off of the iPad camera. And then when you stop recording, they're already in your Project Media section. That's kind of cool. I love the idea of bypassing the import process. It feels very redundant to me to record videos to an SSD on my camera and then take that SSD and plug it into my MacBook, drag the file over to the MacBook SSD, and then access it again through Final Cut. I love the idea of having the camera record video directly into the video editing timeline. timeline. That sounds like it would save time and it would save storage space, because if I could do that with my MacBook in, per se, maybe a USB-C iPhone of some kind in the future that would probably have Thunderbolt, then that would mean I could have like up to 8 terabytes of storage space to record to, and as soon as I stop recording on my iPhone, that video clip is already in the timeline rather than on my phone, which I then have to airdrop or transfer the file into Finder and then access again. So I like the idea of recording video through the video editing application, and they do give you some more pro camera tools like a volume indicator, and they thankfully let you select your mic input, which, yes, technically iPads have supported external microphones for a while, but they gave you next to zero settings. Like, they would immediately switch over to that external mic even if you weren't necessarily wanting to use it yet. And the last time I tried to do it, back when I reviewed the M1 iPad Pro a couple years ago, it had no audio MIDI settings like the Mac has. So that means that it's really compressed and it was super loud and it was very hard to adjust and get it to work with other apps. So it's a little bit nicer that it actually just accepts my Zoom microphone directly through that camera app now, and I can choose which one I want to use rather than it just defaulting. But the other bigger issue is, hilariously, when I plug in my Zoom microphone to the iPad, my iPad immediately starts outputting all of its audio through the Zoom microphone, which has a tiny little speaker on it just to let you play back the audio you recorded. And when you go into AirPlay settings, there's no way to turn that off, because again, iPadOS is the iPad killer. It's ridiculous. Like, there's just no setting that says, please output to the regular iPad speakers. I want to use the iPad speakers with an external microphone, or even someday it would be nice to use an external camera. You know, my MacBook can use my iPhone as a continuity camera. iPad can't do that because iPad. And what made it even more complicated, because I was reviewing an Android phone, was actually getting the pictures off of the Android and onto the iPad, because I use this third-party service called NearDrop on my Mac, which is technically side-loading. I know, I'm acknowledging there's benefits to it, and that lets me kind of replicate Android's nearby share, so that if I'm editing a video on my MacBook and I'm using an Android phone, I can just take the pictures and videos off my Android, hit the MacBook Pro, and boom, wirelessly, without having to upload anything to Google Drive or Google Photos, it sends those pictures and videos to my downloads folder on my MacBook. No way to do that on the iPad, so you either have to use an SSD and hope that the formatting is correct to get files to transfer, and that's assuming that the Files app is working properly on iPadOS, because sometimes it acts buggy, or you have to just upload all of your pictures and videos to Google Drive and then download them again on the Mac, which means it's going to not work if you don't have internet access, if you're editing in the field, or if you're editing at like a local Starbucks or something. The speed at which you can transfer files is going to be based on how fast your internet is, which in 2023, when AirDrop and Nearby Share exist, I'm super freaking annoyed with that. It's like, look, both of these devices have Bluetooth. Both of these devices have Wi-Fi, but you're telling me there's no wireless way for me to just wire these pictures and videos over to that iPad without communicating with some server out in Europe? Like, come on, we should have this figured out by now. I can do it on the Mac thanks to the software support that it has enabled, but I can't do it on the iPad. And I just want to say, if Apple did dual boot macOS on the iPad, I could do all of these things and none of my complaints would be warranted. The only thing I could complain about with editing on the iPad would probably just be battery life and maybe speakers, and all of these software complaints I'm making would not be relevant here. So overall, I am afraid to say this doesn't change my perspective on the iPad at all. Yes, it's technically the best video editing app on the iPad, but unfortunately that's really not saying that much, especially when they expect you to buy the M1 variant, when in my opinion the A12Z and A12X chip are perfectly capable. In fact, I've edited these kinds of tech videos with ProRes and 4K at 60 on my A12X iPad Pro using LumaFusion, and yes, it took longer than it would have taken on my Mac, that's a given, but it was still doable, and it was still objectively cheaper than what it would cost you to pay for Final Cut for an extended period. And I guess why I'm so confused by this video editing app is it's like pitching itself for professionals, like I want to access more tools because DaVinci or LumaFusion or iMovie aren't enough for me, but at the same time not giving you all those pro tools, but also still charging you a lot more than what any other video editing app is going to charge you on the iPad. So if you genuinely care or are interested in these kinds of more professional tools that Final Cut is known for offering, why would you buy this device for that? If you're just looking for this is intro to Final Cut or Final Cut for beginners, then don't buy, you know, a $1,000 iPad if you're just starting out. If you want to get into video editing, I would highly recommend you start out with an M1 MacBook Air, because even then getting that certified refurbished plus paying for Final Cut will be cheaper than this setup, and you'll have more ports, a better battery life, and the fully unlocked version of Final Cut, and more money in your pocket. And honestly, Final Cut for Mac, in my opinion, is not that hard to learn. It's fairly intuitive compared to DaVinci Resolve, which is a lot cheaper than Final Cut, but a lot more analytical, and there's a paid version to unlock certain features. Whereas Final Cut for Mac is honestly kind of like a steal of the century when you consider how long a lot of us video editors have been using it, like over a decade now for some of us. And it was a one-time purchase, and we just keep getting software updates for it. I use it for all kinds of stuff, like even converting things to podcasts and audio files. And there's so many things that end up taking so little clicks. Like one thing that I ended up really appreciating after trying out Final Cut on the iPad, because I was like, wow, I didn't realize Final Cut could suck so bad, is the volume controls on clips. Like, it's so insanely easy on the Final Cut for Mac app to just grab the volume bar and lower it if you just want a clip to be quiet. On this one, you can't click and drag those volume bars. You have to select the clip, then tap volume, and then lower it. So yes, you can do it, but it's more steps. But also on the Final Cut for Mac version, you can take those little pins on the edge of clips, move them inward to have the audio gradually fade out, and then right click to change that volume curve so that it gets quieter faster, or more linearly, or more exponentially. So many options just with 1 or 2 clicks. I don't even know how you freaking do that on the Final Cut for iPad app. I've been right clicking everywhere I can, and no, those options are not as easy to find. They're not as accessible, I guess because iPadOS has to have the little dot cursor approach. They don't want to change that into a blade or into a clicker or anything else that I guess would be useful like the Final Cut for Mac version is. So I honestly was disappointed, even though my expectations were really, really low and my worst fears were realized. I told you guys this is likely going to be a skimmed down, watered down version of Final Cut, just like Swift Playgrounds is a watered down version of Xcode. iPadOS got Stage Manager, which is a watered down version of window managing. iPadOS got a watered down version of iOS widgets. It got a watered down version of external monitor support. They keep watering down everything that they give the iPad, which again, I would be okay with if they were super cheap. But when you make features and apps like Stage Manager or external monitor support or Final Cut and you say this requires the M1 chip, but then you fundamentally limit it this hard, it becomes really, really hard to justify the expense of a device this high. I think iPads are great, honestly, for lots of things. For basic media consumption, for checking email, for just being a device that's a bit bigger than your phone that you want to use on the couch or at home for watching movies and stuff. Yes, they're great, but you don't need an M1 chip in your iPad to access those great iPad features, including the Apple Pencil and note-taking. Like, you can find A12X iPad Pros with Face ID, with 120 Hz, with big screens, and honestly, the A12X chip is still really fast. You can get LumaFusion on that. You can get DaVinci Resolve on that, and it'll do great for those intro to editing courses or editing for beginners. Maybe you're not editing as consistently as I am as a professional, but you want to get into it. You want to learn a little bit about it. Sure, that's great, but if you just want to learn a little bit about it, don't commit to $50 a year or $1,000 plus iPad experience. Like, the only use case I could think of for Final Cut on the iPad is you already bought an M1 iPad, unfortunately, for whatever reason, because you want mini LED for media consumption, or because you bought it for note-taking, or it was a gift or something. Like, you've already got the iPad hardware necessary, and now you want to get into a little bit more advanced video editing, then yes, I guess this is a cheaper option than buying a whole new Mac. But if you don't have an M1 iPad and you're thinking about getting into video editing, no, don't buy the iPad for that reason alone, because it is kind of at this point a jack of many trades, but definitely a master of only note-taking and drawing. So again, I'm not trying to say no one should buy iPads, but I'm kind of sick of messing around like this. Frankly, I've been talking about how the iPad is getting really close to Mac level functionality, but they still fundamentally have to water down everything they put on it. They always have to taint it a little bit and say, yeah, let's make it a little bit harder, let's make it a little bit worse. I've been talking about this since 2018. I remember getting the A12X iPad Pro and I was super excited. I love the hardware and everything, but I still had to keep coming back to my Mac to access certain software. And I got a lot of hope once the Mac switched to Apple Silicon and they started using the same silicon in the iPad as they did the Mac. Then they gave it trackpad support, so I was like, okay, now the iPad's basically being used as a laptop, and it costs more than many MacBooks, so there's gonna be hardware limitations because it's a tablet. It has to be thinner, and the battery can't be as good, and the port selection can't be as good. But if we've got the same silicon on the inside, I feel like we should at least have software parity between functionality and apps. And sure, I was on board that train for a while that said, let's just just let iPadOS come up with its own unique ways of emulating everything the Mac can do, and we waited for a calculator app, for Final Cut, for Xcode, for Logic, and now we kinda got them, but again, they had to scale it back and change it a bunch of ways. So that's why for the past few years I've been saying this isn't the right way to do it. They should just straight up do dual boot macOS, because then we would just get the fully unlocked macOS version of things on the iPad for those who really wanted it, and then you can switch to iPadOS for the user-friendly side, the note-taking side, the media consumption side. Just give us the option to use whichever we feel more comfortable with, because trying to redesign everything to optimize it for the iPad typically just results in watering things down and not bringing as many features. For the sake of, well, hey, you can like draw on top of the video clips. Yeah, that gets gimmicky really fast. It's great for a Casey Neistat video, but after like 2 times you're like, okay, I'm done. And maybe some green screen effects, but they can add that to the Mac version easily, so that's not really exclusive to the iPad either. Ultimately, now I'm just scared and nervous that they're gonna turn my Mac version into a membership. I really don't want that to happen, and frankly, yes, I'm very exhausted trying to edit and make content off the iPad. I'm tired of it being a challenge. I'm tired of there being loopholes. If a device costs this much, it shouldn't be a challenge. It shouldn't be hoops you gotta jump through to try to kind of emulate what a Mac can do. It's just too much. It's just way too complicated, and the Macs have gotten so affordable and so powerful now. If you're wanting a device for video editing, please don't buy an iPad just for that. It's not worth it. Buy an iPad for the note-taking or the media consumption, and please try to keep it under $600 when the secondhand market is this good. But other than that, I really liked it. What do you guys think of Final Cut on the iPad? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. This is your Apple Shapiro. I'll see you all in the next one.